Hey everybody, my name is Matt, and I'm an instructor here in the journalism department. Today, we're going to talk about the exposure triangle, which is basically three variables that we can use to control the amount of light that's coming into our camera to give us a properly exposed image. So if we think about how light comes into a camera, it enters the front of the lens here. And then, after it enters that, we get to our first variable, which is called aperture. The aperture is just like the iris in your eye. When you go into a bright room, your iris closes down. When you're looking at something at night, your iris opens up. So same thing with the camera. You can see it really well using this cinema lens here. You can see as I open the aperture, that opening gets bigger, and as I close it down, that opening gets smaller. So that's variable one. Variable two is our shutter speed. So after the light goes through the lens, it lands on the sensor of the camera. So this, you'll notice that this is a mirrorless camera. So this doesn't have a mechanical shutter like a film camera would. But basically what this is doing is it's activating the sensor for a set period of time. So it could be a slow shutter speed, which is like 1/6 of a second, 1/3 of a second, to a very fast shutter speed, like 1/500th of a second. So the bigger the number on the bottom, the shorter the exposure, if you guys remember fractions from previous schooling. And then, so after we go through aperture and then shutter speed, now we get to ISO, or gain. So that has to do with the internal circuitry of the sensor and inside the camera. So basically, the gain can be used as kind of like a volume knob. So whatever light is coming in physically from the aperture and from the sensor, the ISO can then boost that or turn it down. So those are our three different variables. And you'll see this all over the place. So we have ISO, shutter speed, we'll just call it shutter here, and we have aperture. So I want you guys to think of these as like three volume knobs, basically, or just kind of three knobs that you can play around with. And so these are knobs, by the way. So they all affect the exposure of the image. So we're going to take a look and see exactly how each one affects the brightness of the image and see the variables that we can play with there. Okay, so what we have here is my camera pointed at this set. And what I want you guys to really pay attention to is this waveform right here. So you can see right now we have a properly exposed image where we have our whites are right at 100 up there at the top, and our blacks are kind of right down here, pretty close to 0. We have a nice tonal range in the middle. So now I want to start playing with these different variables that we talked about. So if you guys remember, our first variable was aperture, right? So with this lens that I have on here can go down all the way to f/22. So you can see as I start to bring the aperture down, you can see the image is getting darker. And again, that's the only thing I'm changing. If I take this off of here, you can see we're at f/14, and I can drop all the way down to f/22 right there. So, and again, if I pull up my waveform, you can see right here that it is just really, really dark. So now, as I open back up, if I open up to f/2.8, now if I look at my waveform, as you close down your aperture, it's called stopping down. So as I stop down just a little bit, you can see that everything kind of evens out, but as I open up, it all starts to kind of get just a little bit too bright. So that's our first variable, is aperture. So you can see as I open up the aperture, the number gets smaller. And that's one thing that's a little bit just something to think about. So now I'm at f/2.8, but it's really bright, like the lens is wide open. And then as I close down, as I get to f/22, the number is bigger, but the opening is smaller. So those are inversely related. So I'm going to open back up so we can get back to kind of proper exposure here. Again, looking at my waveform down there. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to play around with our shutter speed. So you can see right now this says this is 1/48th of a second. So as I go up, remember the bigger the number, the faster the shutter speed. You can see that that is also darkening the image. Now I'm at 1/1000th, and you can see the image is really dark. Again, because the sensor is just exposing light for a very short amount of time. On the inverse side of that, if I make this go way down to like 1/24th, you can see that we got a lot brighter of an image, right? So there's our second variable in play. So I'm going to bring this back to proper exposure. So we're at f3.5, so we're pretty wide open. We're at 1/48th of a second for shutter speed. And now we're going to play with our ISO, or our gain. So right now I'm at 850, which is what they call the native ISO of this sensor. That's why there's brackets around it. But watch, if I go up, as my ISO increases, look how bright that gets. You can just tell visually. And then if we look at our waveform, if I bring that up big again, you can see everything is just way up at the top. And then on the inverse side, if I start to bring it down, we lose a lot of exposure there. So right now I'm at ISO 320. That's the lowest that this camera goes. So again, each of these variables raises and lowers exposure, but how they're related gives you a lot of creative control. Okay, I want to show you guys some of the intention behind why we might want to expose a certain way using a certain set of variables in our exposure triangle. So right now we have this amazing looking shot of these two lenses. It's very dramatic. And you can see right now I'm at f2.8. My ISO is at the native ISO of 850, and I'm at 1/48th of a second. And if I pull up my waveform, I'm properly exposed. I can maybe go up just a little bit. I'm going to be okay with staying at 850. Okay? So right now we can only see one lens that's in focus. So what is in focus is called depth of field. So as you open up your aperture, so again, smaller f number, the shallower your depth of field. So you can see right now this lens is in focus, but that other one is not. So you can see as I start to stop down, again, my f number getting bigger, now I obviously have less light. So I'm going to increase my ISO so that we can actually see what's happening here. So if you take a look now, that back lens in the back is way more in focus. You can almost read the Canon on the lens hood right there. And then if I stop down even more, that's really going to come into focus. So right now I'm at f16, and look how in focus both of those lenses are. That's something really important to notice. So you might think, oh wow, okay, this is a good looking shot. I can see both lenses, but what I want you to notice is this ISO is at 20,000. So you probably can't really see it on that monitor, but this is a kind of a noisy image, unfortunately. So the higher the ISO, the higher the noise that gets introduced. But again, if creatively you want to show two things that are or two things in the same scene, and you want them both in focus, you need to stop down. So again, I'm at f16, I have a really high ISO, and I chose to keep my shutter speed the same. But I just know that now my gain is going to be higher, so I might have a little bit noisier image. Or another thing we could do is put more light on this image. Again, because there's less light coming in through the aperture, again, because our aperture is so small, we need to either put more light or be okay with just a noisier image. So let me go back to, let me open back up. And you can see as I open up, you can see my F number is getting smaller. And now we're kind of going nuclear here on our image. So I'm going to drop this back down to our native 850. And look how much different that image looks. You can barely even tell that's a lens back there. You might even think it's like a coffee mug. So that's a very real example of how ISO and aperture are related and kind of play together. Okay, in this example, I want to talk about how shutter speed and ISO and aperture are all related, and how you can make some creative decisions with shutter speed, just like we did with aperture. So I'm going to take this lens cap and I'm going to spin it here on the table. So right now you can see we're at 1/148th of a second, and you can see what that looks like. You can applaud my lens spinning skills later. So now, if we want to kind of freeze fast action, so this would be good for like sports, or if you're doing an action scene where you want things to look like they're a little bit more frozen in time. I'm going to, again, increase our shutter speed. So remember, the higher the number on the bottom, the shorter the exposure. So I'm just going to go do kind of an extreme example here of 1/500th of a second. So you can see, again, on our waveform, we are very underexposed. So first thing I'm going to do is open up my aperture. And so, again, this lens only goes to f2.8, so I've maxed out my aperture. So now the next thing I want to do is work on my ISO. Right? Personally, I always like to do my aperture before my ISO, because as I know, as soon as I touch my ISO, I start to introduce noise. So I'm going to just punch my ISO up here until I get a good exposure. So you can see now I'm at ISO 4000, I'm at f2.8, and I'm at 1/500th of a second. So our exposure looks pretty good, but I want you guys to notice how the lens cap spins this time versus how it did last time. You might notice that you can see more of the action. It looks a little bit more frozen in time compared to when we were just at 1/48th of a second. I'll do it one more time. And you can see now, since our depth of field is shallower, since we're at 2.8, we're kind of lost focus on it a little bit there. So that's just another example of why you might want a higher shutter speed if you're trying to achieve a certain look in your video. But again, because we have a shorter exposure, we're up to 1/500th of a second, we have to open up our aperture, increase our ISO, but if we didn't want to do those things, we just have to put more light on it. All right, everybody, that's it for this video. I hope you found this helpful, and you now know how to more creatively control the types of shots you want to get using ISO, aperture, and shutter.